Okay. Let's see. Our next question is from Dan from Nashville. And he said, and this is on the topic of Native Americans, epigenetics, and run-on sentences. Dan says, hey, I have heard on your podcast as well as other ancestral podcasts the subject of racial epigenetics being brought up, but I never hear it mentioned in a broad aspect. And I was wondering if there was any evidence or even philosophy behind it that you have noticed. I'm mostly Native American with some white mutt thrown in too. I noticed that on most reservations, natives are almost always obese, and I've begun to wonder if being carb sensitive is genetic. You don't have to tell me that alcohol and substance abuse is rampant on reservations, but I sometimes wonder how much is environmental and how much is based on the fact that most sugars and grains were brought over with white culture. I know Inuits are always an example of ketogenic diets and health, but I am Creek from the Georgia area of the United States and would assume that eating very low carb may not have been part of a people group living in a more fertile area. So I would love your opinion on this, as well as if you touched on other races based on region as well, even if it's mostly a philosophical perspective. I also know the stereotype of Kenyans being great distance runners or Jamaicans being better sprinters, but are there other athletic genetic tendencies for other people groups? Lastly, is the reason we never heard of this because we are too racially sensitive and everyone fears that they will be equated with Hitler talking eugenics, or is there just not enough evidence?
Man, that's a good one. That may definitely get us peeled out of any social media platforms. I'm actually going to start at the end of that, and it is interesting. There's great evidence that certain groups like the Kenyans folks from the areas like Kenya, Tanzania tend to be more slow twitch dominant and particularly good at it and appear to have some adaptations that are beneficial from an oxygen transport perspective. There are genetic modifications within Himalayan populations that have afforded them better tolerance to altitude, which big surprise. Like a lot of these people live at, levels 15,000 feet, 20 feet. That's where they live most of their lives. And so there have been selection pressures around that. There are other groups that definitely seem to have a tendency towards a more fast twitch phenotype. So we're able to talk about that stuff a little bit, but then it gets super murky because we start extrapolating things beyond that, like IQ and all kinds of stuff. And the big challenge is that I think that there are some really worthwhile things to discuss around that. And I'm trying to think, there was a guy who was on Joe Rogan. I'm blanking on his name. I'll try to remember what it was and get into the show notes. But he's an evolutionary biologist, and he's talked about this stuff. And this guy has just been railed upon because some people call him a eugenicist and racist and all the rest of this stuff. And he's doing some really solid research, and by all accounts, as far as I can tell, the dude is not racist. He's just trying to do some good science and ask some questions, which are sometimes uncomfortable and make us look at ourselves and look at our society and look at the way that things function. But discomfort actually allows us, we can't actually change anything. So this is one good thing out of the Mark Manson book, which is if you are in a fucked up situation, either individually or societally, you must go through a process of discomfort to get to a spot where it is no longer fucked up. And that's just all there is to it. So if we create a society in which we cannot be uncomfortable because of all this fear attached to it, then we are pretty much we are ossifying. We are casting our society in amber and guaranteeing that it never changes and never improves. So there's that. And I'm sure I'm a fucking racist for saying that stuff. So I'm mildly bitter about that stuff. But so, I mean, there are great population-based studies that show that more First Nations people, Native Americans are definitely at higher likelihood for the metabolic diseases of affluence. And there was just a report written up recently that Mexicans in general, which there's a huge amount of variation within that, people who have more Mayan heritage versus more European heritage and all kinds of admixtures around that. But in general, when you lump the totality of the Mexican population together, they're like 400% more likely to develop type 2 diabetes than a European individual. So there's definitely stuff to this. The work that we did with the Chickasaw Nation, they're at like 80 to 85% obesity bordering on diabetes within their population, which is much higher than the standard population. There's lots of factors that go into that. Socioeconomic issues, marginalization issues, like there's all kinds of stuff. But there is, if we separate all that stuff out, I think that there's still a very viable case for there's some genetic predispositions around that stuff. And there was a question related to, would a very low carb diet be part of the ancestral experience for someone who is a Creek from the Georgia area? The Chickasaw were originally from the kind of Mississippi Valley area and then were displaced from there. And I wouldn't say that. So there have been some great takedown pieces on the Inuit. The Inuit have been held up as like a ketogenic society. The interesting thing is that they developed a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism, related to fat metabolism and the ability to produce ketone bodies, which makes them largely incapable of entering ketosis. And there's reasons behind that. We've talked about it on the podcast before, but I don't think in general, like the protein carb fat ratios of our ancestors were consistently those of what we would see consistent with a ketogenic diet, but exercise, intermittent fasting.
And there would have been a lot of seasonal variability.
Tons of seasonal variability.
Even in a really fertile region.
Yeah. So I see no problem with even as a reset kind of story, shifting into a quite low carb period for someone, and then just kind of playing with things. And then there's also the reality that although the ancestral model is very informative, at the end of the day, you kind of have to play to what the clinical outcomes are. And if you just don't do particularly well with carbs, then maybe you need to eat fewer carbs. In theory, I should do great with grains. I should do pretty well with wheat and oats and all that. And I do terribly with all of them. So I'm 10% Native American, and I'm more, it's largely out of Mexico. So I'm more Mexican than Luis Villaseñor is, but it's really interesting. That's where like some of the heritage stuff is interesting, but you almost have to hang that up and just cater to what the clinical outcomes are.